This is BBC News. I'm Sean Lay. The headlines at 10. Two British men accused of carrying out beheadings for the so-called Islamic State have complained that they won't get a fair trial after they lost their citizenship. The UN calls for an independent investigation as 16 Palestinians are killed in clashes with Israeli forces on the Gaza border. Russia announces further measures against UK diplomats. Expulsions of officials from 23 other countries are also announced. More tears and further apologies in the wake of Australia cricket's cheating scandal. Former vice-captain David Warner says he knows he might never again play for the national team.
Right now, it is hard to know what comes next, but first and foremost, is the well-being of my family.
Going for gold, students from around the world are put through their paces in Cornwall in the International Mining Games. And coming up, the travel show visits a conservation project on Mauritius aiming to protect the island's one remaining native mammal, the fruit bat. Hello, very good morning to you. Welcome to BBC News. Two British men believed to have been members of the group that calls itself Islamic State, the cell known as the Beatles, have complained they can't have a fair trial because the UK government has stripped them of their citizenship. Alexander Coty and El Shafi El Sheikh, whose group is thought to have murdered more than 20 hostages, spoke to journalists in northern Syria after being detained. James Waterhouse reports.
Alexander Coty and El Shafi El Sheikh became part of the most infamous gang of foreign fighters within the Islamic State group. Along with fellow Londoners Mohammed M. Wazi, the killer nicknamed Jihadi John, who was killed in an American airstrike, and Ain Davis, who was jailed in Turkey, the pair are linked to a string of hostage murders in Iraq and Syria during the militants' bloody uprising. They include Alan Henning, a driver and aid worker from Eccles, and David Haynes, a long-time aid worker from Perth. Speaking to the Associated Press from a cell in northern Syria, Alexander Coty described the executions as something that was regrettable by the American-backed Syrian Democratic Forces, a Kurdish-led militia. The Home Office hasn't commented on whether the pair have been stripped of their citizenship. Last month, the Home Secretary Amber Rudd said she was absolutely convinced and committed to the idea of them facing justice. The Defence Secretary, Gavin Williamson, however, says the men should not return to Britain because they turned their backs on British values. Their interview comes a day after a UK soldier, embedded with US forces, was killed by a roadside bomb in a counter-terrorism operation against the militants, making him the first British member of the armed forces killed in combat fighting IS. James Waterhouse, BBC News.
Well, with me now is Defence correspondent Robert Fox from the Evening Standard newspaper. Robert, good to have you with us. Let me ask you first of all about the Home Office is not confirming or denying that they've had their citizenship revoked, but what are the implications for them if that is the case?
Well, what happens next? Because it could be a bit of a free-for-all because different allied nations take a different approach to this. A really quite hard-over example is Canada. Canada will bring to justice, or feels it is entitled to bring to justice, anybody, anywhere who has perpetrated or is suspected of perpetrating a grievous act against a Canadian citizen. He or she must come before Canadian law or allied Canadian law somewhere. And the allied point, I think, is the thing. Amber Rudd, it's very interesting what she was pointing to. And she's pointing at some kind of international arrangement. Britain is part of the ICC, the International Criminal Court, after all, and possibly they're going to push to go to that route.
The government's argument, certainly from the Defence Secretary Gavin Williamson, was that these men had turned their back on British values, as he put it, and that therefore they shouldn't be even given the opportunity of an appearance in a British court. It's something that should be dealt with, if you like, elsewhere. Are there countervailing political pressures on this? Are there those who will argue that, no, these guys should be tried here because some of the victims were British?
Yes, and I think that's a very strong argument. There's also a very strong argument, very difficult to argue in this case, that you cannot make somebody deliberately stateless. Now, come on, let's abandon the principle for a minute and look at the practicalities. Why this was done and said was that they didn't want blowback. They didn't want the associates of Mwazi, whom these are, they can't deny that, Jihadi John, coming back, potentially going underground, causing trouble or triggering things. Think of the Trèbes, Carcassonne incident, which was a spontaneous explosion picking up the jihadi message from IS. And this was part of the argument, particularly when Mwazi himself was being identified and then was killed by a drone strike. It's to stop any idea that these people can come home and perhaps can get forgiveness. That is not nearly as serious as I think it appeared at the time, because actually, yes, there has been a drift back, but nothing like, as far as I can make out, to the degree expected.
The numbers are contested, aren't they? And in truth, we don't know the number of people who from this country who went to fight with the Islamic State group, some who may still be in Syria or in Iraq. But in practical terms, if these men were put on trial, let's say in an international environment, how difficult is it to build up a case?
I think the case is very strong, and the evidence being brought forward, the argumentation rather, by the Americans in particular, and they're saying, particularly in the case of Shafi el-Sheikh, that they have got him for talking to hostages that were ransomed about waterboarding and torturing and being proud of torturing.
There are potential identifications.
And the Americans will want him. And I think that this is why, I mean, for me, in my journalistic experience, this is the most egregious case of the American joke of the guy who murdered his father and mother and then threw himself on the mercy of the court for being an orphan. And this, it's the explaining away, which is absolutely eye-watering, and it's been reported faithfully right across the media, because they could go, if they insist under international auspices, before American justice, if Americans have been tortured and killed by them, and then they're really in for the high jump. There is a potential death penalty, and I think that they realise this. What do I think is going to happen? I think the Amber Rudd, very sensible argumentation will obtain, but it's yet another phase for the international justice system and the International Criminal Court, which is such an important part now of global anti-terror and the security apparatus. But this is very embryonic. It's still emerging. And
therefore, there is an argument for saying that it is in everybody's interest, all those countries who are fighting groups of this kind, wherever they may be in the world, to kind of sign up to some kind of international... I mean, that sort of argument is now going to gain ground, do you think? Because there are those who are sceptical about the effectiveness of international courts.
Well, they've done a lot more than were expected initially. And we've had ICTY with Yugoslavia, and which has been problematic and was long and drawn out, but astonishing success in cases like Liberia and of course Rwanda and Burundi, which is terribly important. But I know you can point to egregious cases like the Democratic Republic of Congo. No, you can't turn the clock back. This is a very, very important area now, particularly when there are such serious charges as crimes against humanity and genocide. And these are quite clearly crimes that these chaps are being